Time travel!
Hey guys, and welcome back to the show. Today we're going to be talking about travel. But because no one's allowed to go outside anymore and airports are shut down and borders are shut down, we're going to talk about time travel instead. Especially the time travel that was proposed to us in the penultimate episode of the MCU Avengers Endgame. We're going to answer some of the questions that you might have had after watching that movie. Like, why can't they just go back and grab Natasha? Or why don't they just use time travel to solve all their problems now? Or why doesn't change in the past affect the future? Or how does Captain get there if they're on a different timeline? Anyways, for all those answers and more, keep watching Constant Review. The concept of time travel itself is not new or original to the sci-fi genre by far. Even the movie Avengers Endgame lists many previous examples of works that have involved time travel in order to explain how time travel is going to work in their universe.
Star Trek, Terminator, Time Cop, Time After Time,
Quantum Leap,
Wrinkle in Time, Somewhere in Time,
Hot Tub Time Machine.
Hot Tub Time Machine, Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. Basically, any movie that deals with time travel.
Every single time travel tends to lead to weird time paradoxes and unintended consequences and butterfly effect repercussions and things that you just can't predict, leading to time travel being a cluster fork of great television. In general, we have three main schools of time travel. So, option 1, time travel can change the future. Option 2, time travel can't change the future. And option 3, time travel won't change the future. In option A, the effects of you going back in time lead time to diverge, and therefore the timeline that you return to when you return to the present won't be the same as it used to be. The most famous example of this has to be Back to the Future, and Back to the Future 2, and Back to the Future 3. But there are also plenty of other examples of this, including the butterfly effect, where it's clearly shown how going back in time changes the future, and every action that's done in the past has consequences. The second option is that time travel can't change the future. And in these options, whenever a character tries to go to the past, it doesn't change anything because that's what they always would have done. This option is most iconic in Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, when the events of Harry going back in time does not change the future, as they have always gone back in time and they've just trapped in a time loop that they haven't experienced yet. Another example of this is Terminator, where the events of sending Reese back in time are just the end part of a loop that the main character knew about because they had already experienced it, as well as the movie Arrival, where the protagonist uses information that they know about the future in order to affect the past. That leads us to our third option, in which time travel won't affect the future. Demonstrated to us in the movie The Time Machine, as well as the show Lost, and pretty much every Final Destination movie ever, in which no matter what the characters try to do, it won't change the future. In the words of Eloise Hawking,
the universe, unfortunately, has a way of course correcting.
so which of these explains time travel as proposed to us in Avengers Endgame? The answer is none of them. Yep, Avengers Endgame gives us a completely different interpretation on how time travel works in their universe.
If you travel to the past, that past becomes your future. And your former present becomes the past, which can't now be changed by your new future.
Exactly.
Time travel for them doesn't so much involve them going back into their own timeline, but instead going into a parallel timeline and by and large creating a new timeline in the multiverse. Every time that they go back in time travel, they are in fact creating a new timeline that is different than their original timeline. In their timeline, Loki went to prison and was held in captivity in Asgard. In the new timeline, created when they go back to visit the events of the Avengers, Loki escapes. In their timeline, Peter Quill grabs the Power Stone from Morag. In the new timeline that they create, the Power Stone is taken before that by Rhodey. In their timeline, Natalie Portman has to be taken to another planet and have the ether pulled out of her by a really albino guy. But in the new timeline, she gets stabbed with a non-sterilized needle by an Asgardian rabbit. And possibly most critically, in their timeline, Steve goes into the ice and doesn't wake up for over 70 years. But in the new timeline, Steve goes back and spends the rest of his life with Peggy Carter. This works like the Vat of Acid episode of Season 4 of Rick and Morty, where every single time they go travel through time, they create a new timeline and have permanent implications and effects on that timeline. So how many new timelines do they create by doing this time heist? Well, let's work our way through it. They created a new timeline in 2012 when they visited the Avengers. They created a new timeline in 2014 when they visited Guardians of the Galaxy. They created a timeline in 2013 for when they visited Thor the Dark World. And they created a timeline in 1970 when they went back to steal Pym particles and the Tesseract from the S.H.I.E.L.D. base. Because these timelines are permanently different than their original timeline, Cap doesn't need to return the stones to exactly where he took them from in order to preserve the timeline. In fact, these timelines can no longer be preserved. They will always, for the rest of their existence, be different than the Prime timeline. So, the reason why they can't use time travel to go and bring Natasha back with them is because if they did that, it would be akin to stealing a version of Natasha from a different timeline, not unlike the plot to BioShock Ultimate. In fact, continued use of time travel just creates more and more branches, and therefore more branches, more problems, and you have to then spend all the time going back and trimming all those branches. And that's why they can't use time travel to solve their problems, because every time they do, they'll create more alternate realities that they're going to have to resolve as well. What we need to look at is whether this entire exchange, this entire creation of new timelines was stable. And what I mean by that is this should be a closed system, where the number of timelines they needed to resolve their problem has to be enough that each timeline after they had been created could be resolved without creating more timelines. That means in order for this to be a stable system, they cannot be creating more timelines in the timelines that they themselves created in this movie. We saw the reason why they needed to go back and needed to create these extra timelines was to undo the snap caused by Thanos at the end of Infinity War. Which is a pretty simple problem for one timeline. In the Guardians of the Galaxy timeline, there no longer is a Thanos there, and therefore the snap will never occur in that timeline. But there are 4 other timelines that could each end up branching and creating more and more timelines, diverging constantly unless someone goes back and trims those branches. That is why Captain America needed to go back.
Don't worry, Bruce. Clip all the branches.
In addition to having to return the stones to their own proper timelines, Cap needed to ensure that those branches were all trimmed. Which means, if Avengers Endgame was huge for us, Cap needs to go back and kill and defeat Thanos in 4 more timelines to stop the snap from happening there too. And figure after having to defeat Thanos 5 different times, Cap is entitled to little R&R. So after completing this heroic undertaking, Cap would have to take off his time travel suit to avoid being brought back when Hulk pushes the button in 2023, and instead getting to spend the next 7 years living and working with Peggy Carter, and finally having his new friends he made in his brand new timeline build a new suit to get him back to the main timeline to hand off his shield. So guys, that's how time travel works in Avengers Endgame. So if you were hoping to use Avengers style time travel in order to get us out of this pandemic, then there's not hope there. I guess the only hope left to you is stay inside and watch some more Constant Review. See you next time. Bye.